was like walking back to the place I'm staying, and then I came across this dude who had fallen on the street. He seemed like some old dude, and there were a bunch of people around him, but like none of them could speak English. So for me, like walking along a street in London, it was kind of weird that I had to like step up and I helped basically convey to the 999 person, what was going on, because I was the only one. Well, I had the most proficient English, so uh, I was basically talking to this 999 correspondent and saying like, yeah, we're at this like location. I think the guy had some sort of epileptic fit, so he was like lying on his side. It was a bit weird, but like for me, for some reason, I wasn't like stressed by the situation, which I found quite interesting. But like the ambulance came and they asked a bunch of questions, and then you kind of see the situation. There was one of his friends was holding this bottle, and I was like, it's probably something like alcohol related, which is another thing about the UK. They've got quite a big binge drinking culture. Well, so there were two Asian people. The one had the phone, and then the guy's friend was like Spanish, and obviously the guy on the floor couldn't really speak properly. He was kind of like shouting, but he was also being quite funny about the situation, which I think is also quite a British trait. Uh, he's like, "Oh, what do you think? What do you think? I'm lying on the floor." I kind of left him in the hands of the helpful ambulance staff. So yeah, that was on my way home, and it's been less than 7 days in. I'm already having some exciting experiences.
Nice. So, today we are going to be chatting about energy. Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, and I mean we did kind of cover it in one of our previous episodes. I think it was episode 5 or something like that.
So, that was more about electric vehicles specifically.
Yeah, so that was the issue of transportation, which I'd say is maybe the second biggest mix in terms of pollutants.
Specifically car-based transportation, or I guess we talked a bit about like electric trams and stuff, but air transportation, whole other ball game.
So this is going to be more from the transportation side. It's going to be directly on the energy side, uh, focusing on production of energy. So let's just start with a question: what are the kind of forms of energy generation? What are the most popular ones?
I actually have these numbers right in front of me.
Let me guess. Well, I know in South Africa we are very heavily geared towards coal. We do have a portion that is nuclear.
Hmm.
I know there's solar and wind is becoming more popular. I think I went for a drive out towards, I think it was Montague, and you can go over those hills, and there's like all of those wind turbines. That's quite good to see. But I'd say that that's maybe less than a percent of the mix.
Yeah. So globally, we have what's this? 10% of whoopsie, 10% of our roughly 10% of our energy supply comes from renewables, and so we're talking about hydro, we're talking about geothermal, solar, wind energy, and biofuels, which is arguably sustainable. And then globally, we have about 4% of our energy supply coming from nuclear power. And the rest of it is from three fossil fuel sources: oil, gas, and coal. And I think that, obviously this changes from country to country. France is actually quite nuclear dependent, whereas South Africa is predominantly coal dependent because we have pretty good coal reserves. And then if you take a look at, say, Norway, where they've got all that glacial runoff, is they're predominantly hydroelectric power. But the issue that we have currently, and this is pretty obvious to everyone who's followed anything for the past 20 years, is that the burning of fossil fuels creates climate change through emitting CO2 into the atmosphere, which allows a greenhouse effect to happen where the sun rays get into the atmosphere and can't necessarily escape, leading to the atmosphere heating up little by little over the years and causing different weather patterns which have knock-on effects, etc., etc.
So the other part of it is maybe if we take a step back, why is energy important in a
Mm-hmm.
society? And it's one of those things that it's kind of an indicator, because a lot of things that bring about economic prosperity, things like manufacturing, industry, um, those, although in a sense in the third world it's more prevalent that the industry is what drives the sort of modernization of those countries. Those kind of industries do require a certain level of power security. If you think of trying to convert raw materials into something that's usable, such as like a metal component, or some sort of car, or going up to things like space shuttles and things like that, you do need to have a constant supply of energy. And so energy production can be a kind of measure of how much capacity is within the economic uh, framework of the country.
Energy is super important for pretty much every human endeavor, right? And I think that when, because we've been listening to a lot of anti climate change talk over the past, however many years that it's been in the public eye, is we've come to demonize fossil fuels. But the actual reason that fossil fuels are bad is actually because of how useful they are. Is that they are incredible wells of energy at our disposal that we just need to like pull out of the ground and burn, right? And then we can use that energy however we want. And it's because of this ease of access that makes them kind of dangerous. As an example, a campfire gives off more carbon dioxide and carbon monoxide than, say, burning coal. But we don't all sit in traffic of, 1,000 campfires every morning on the way to work, right? And so no one thinks of campfires as being bad for the environment.
Yeah,
And it all comes down to scale, right? Is
but
that we're using so much fossil fuels because of how useful they are. And the fact of the matter is that if fossil fuels didn't give off carbon dioxide, right, which is causing the greenhouse effect, is they would actually be the perfect fuel source. I mean, not perfect in terms of efficiency. Is you're only getting a fraction of the actual energy that's stored inside of there because you're just breaking those hydrocarbon bonds when you burn it, but you're getting a hell of a lot of essentially solar energy or historical solar energy
yeah,
by breaking those hydrocarbon bonds, and it's super useful.
it's that like when you're in grade 5, you learn about energy is never created or destroyed, it's always like converted from one to the other. But
Hmm.
in that campfire example, what you're probably doing there, if you think about what the trade-offs are, you're trading off your environmental impact by burning this wood for the warmth of the fire, which is some sort of opportunity cost that you're exchanging. Why wouldn't you stop having campfires? Because it has some sort of benefit that outweighs the downside of burning the fuel.
So to go specifically back to fires, actually historically, there's really good examples of this. Is that across the what is now the developed world, is we used to use wood as fuel to heat our homes, and cities like London in the winter used to be cloyingly just super polluted. Is you walk down the street over there, people were just like coughing up their lungs on the sidewalk, and this was before COVID, because of the just amount of carbon monoxide and carbon dioxide in the air, as well as all the other particulate matter that comes from smoke, right?
Mm.
And right now, London does have fumes from traffic and stuff, but it is nowhere near that
Mm.
same just
Yeah,
overwhelming air pollution that comes from so many fires that are being burned for
Mm.
warmth. So we've we've definitely made progress over there. Currently, as far as I understand, in London, they have big oil-powered boilers that happen outside of the city, which then transport hot water in insulated pipes into the city that then run on radiators that keep everyone warm. And that's a good example of us shifting from wood, which isn't super efficient, to coal or oil, which is more efficient. Not brilliant, but it's more efficient. And now we're trying to figure out how do we make it more efficient or generate it from a cleaner source.
It probably came out of that, innovation around direct current versus alternating current. So that allowed for transportation of energy across distances. So you could, in fact, take one of those coal plants that was in the city and move it to the outskirts or move it even further out. So not having that in your mind, or not having that pollution. And even in London, they went a step further, because even with moving those power plants away, the traffic pollution was enough that they had to implement like low emission zones and even an ultra low emission zone.
Mhm. Not to mention catalytic converters in I think all cars, not necessarily all motor vehicles, but all cars have to
Yeah.
have catalytic converters that convert the carbon monoxide into carbon dioxide.
And there's also tax incentives of like, if your car is older than 3 years, then you have to do like a yearly MOT to make sure that it's not going to impact the environment. There's all these measures, but moving that power away kind of gave you that kind of freedom and less pollution. And obviously, there's not as much, awareness about it, and that's probably why the thing of global warming, although it's been around for a long time, it kind of creeps up on people, and people don't think about it all the time because it's not something that's a constant factor. So the question is, should we just all generate electricity in our own homes?
I actually I think that that would be a really really neat idea, and that's one of the ideas of solar power is that solar power is inherently decentralized. We fill up everyone fills up their roofs with solar panels, and then there's no need to be hooked up to the electrical grid because you're generating your electricity locally, which means that all that infrastructure that transports energy around doesn't necessarily need to exist. And also, you have a lot of like energy loss over distance. So, energy that's generated outside of the city at a nuclear or coal power plant, it needs to travel, couple couple hundred k's to get into the city, and we've got a lot of energy loss over that distance. So yes, I would love to see the world sort of decentralize into uh, everyone producing power for their own homes.
You've got the power station, right? So there's this element called base load. So it's kind of, a consistent load that you have to have within the network in order to supply the or meet the demand of those homes. And
Hmm.
baseload is kind of, you would say, it's very stable. And then you have alternative sources that will supplement that base load. So for instance, you can use solar to supplement, or you know uh, you can have more. It's got more of a sort of phasic. It's more phasic. So if you think of a solar panel, during the night it's not generating anything. So the problem with electricity is, unless you store it somehow, you have to be generating uh, as efficiently so that you're meeting that demand without an overlap. If every house had solar panels, there's an argument that would be said that they could be over generating electricity and not consuming enough. So you would need to store it somewhere. And then obviously there's the implications of having, power sharing and complications in the grid. What is the argument about having solar as a consistent base load? Well, a cool thing to think about is, some places in the world, such as South Africa, have geysers. And a geyser is good because you can basically take an event, which is like having a hot shower in the morning where you need energy, and you're taking that energy and you're basically supplying it over a longer period of time to heat that water up. Whereas in the UK, where they've got lots of energy, you get these instant hot water machines where you basically turn on the tap and it's basically boiling the water as it comes out the tap. So you can think of that as like in the morning, everyone wakes up, they're all having a shower, they're putting on a kettle. It's kind of a big event, and if you don't have capacity to meet that demand, then you're going to have blackouts and all of those kind of things.
So what you're describing over there, it was explained to me as the duck's head problem, right?
Mm.
Is that in the morning you've got a spike in power use as everyone gets up, they take showers, they put some toast in the toaster, and then it drops a bit as everyone gets into their cars and they head off to work. And then during the day, because there's economic activity, it kind of rises and it peaks in the middle of the day, and then it starts declining over the afternoon until about 5:30 p.m. And then there's this huge spike, right? It's because people get home, they kick off their shoes, they go and they take another shower, they start making dinner, right? Which, as you know, electrical stoves take up a huge amount of energy. They turn on the television, they do all that stuff in the afternoon. You've got this huge spike in power usage. And then by 7 o'clock, everyone starts winding down. And then by the time 9 o'clock hits, you just see the energy usage drop to its lowest point, and it stays there throughout the night. So it looks a bit like a duck. You got the tail in the morning, and then you've got the head in the afternoon, and it is keeping up with those spikes that is pretty difficult for renewables, because as you well know, with solar panels, is you in the morning it's not producing much energy. Well, at night it wasn't producing any energy, and then it just progressively gets more and more productive throughout the day, peaking around midday or early afternoon, and then it starts declining as the sun starts sinking in the sky, which does, if you took those two graphs and you put them on top of each other, you'd see that, like, that morning and that afternoon spike just come right off there. So what's convenient about a coal power plant, or any form of fossil fuel power plant, is that it can be ramped up or down on demand, right? So it's like, oh, we're going into the afternoon, we start burning more coal, more energy is produced to satisfy that. We kind of like tone it down at night.
We say that it can be ramped up and down, but if you think of like a coal power plant, to ramp it up and down, it is something that takes a little bit longer. So the base load is a base load for a reason. It's because it's very hard to have a very it's hard to match that duck curve. Like if a power plant can match that duck curve, then you basically, you're set for life, because you can sell that idea and make millions of it. So there is an argument about wind. Like wind could be a bit more consistent if it is in a windy area. I mean, Cape Town, at sometimes you feel like it's the windiest city in the world. So you could have a consistency there, but then again, it's also, with climate change and I think it's called the climate catastrophe now. Is that there's going to be, unpredictability. You can't predict the weather, and even more
Mm.
so when all of these climate things are happening. And then the other side is that there's an argument about the effect of solar panels and the environmental impact of production of solar panels, and also the disposal of solar panels once they reach end of life. We probably haven't got to that stage when we've got like stockpiles of disposed solar panels. That begs the question, and it's probably one that's a bit topical, is that should we just go nuclear and have a nuclear power plant, and we just, connect it to our existing grid of electricity, and then have, as we do, we don't have to do all of this like smart grid stuff within the city. We don't have to set up solar panels, and arguably it's a little bit more simple.
So I'm glad you brought it up. Is I think that nuclear energy is probably the most controversial form of energy generation, because of how catastrophic it can be, but also because of how green and how efficient of an energy it is. So when I'm gonna like go deep down to just like energy physics, right?
Start
Is
with the
that
particle.
we're starting with the particle. When old Einstein did his, came up with his equation, E equals mc squared, we realized that like mass has a fuck ton of energy stored in it, right? The amount of energy stored in it is equal to mass multiplied by c, the speed of light, essentially squared, which is a lot. But the only way that you would be able to extract all of that energy from that mass is if it collided with the same mass of antimatter, right? And then they cancel each other out. The mass itself completely disappears and it gets converted entirely into energy, right? That would be the perfect solution. Unfortunately, we can't make antimatter in any any distinct quantities yet. That so the next best thing that we can do is use atomic physics to either split or fuse atoms together and release the energy stored in those atomic bonds. And that's where you've got fusion and fission. Fusion being two atoms being atoms being compressed together, so with so much force that they fuse into a plasma, releasing that energy. That's how the sun works, but it gets that gets that massive amount of force from gravity. Whereas with fission, we go and we do some stuff with fissile material and essentially split them, causing a chain reaction.
Within a reactor, for instance, you have this kind of, well, in a fission reactor, you have this problem where you've got something that's reacting, and you've got these fuel rods which are essentially controlling that reaction so that it doesn't get super critical. And anyone who's watched the Chernobyl series or anything around that will know that once the fuel rods are in, like fully in, then it's controlling that reaction, because at the end of the day, what's happening is particles are being emitted and they're hitting another particle, and that's going to cause a chain reaction. And the only way you can kind of prevent that is have these fuel rods that are embedded in the material, the fissile material, and it's basically just absorbing and making sure that it's contained. Now the problem is, if you pull out those fuel rods, then you've got this chance where you're going to have a big explosion. And on the top of minds are things like Chernobyl and more recently Fukushima, where there's been massive environmental damage. But then arguably it's also to a certain extent within a certain, range. And I mean, technology has progressed a lot since you know, those things were built. And even in our own, in South Africa's sense, I think Kuiberg, it was built in the 1950s or something like that. So it's a pretty old power station. And these were all built quite a long time ago. On the fusion side, I think there's only one or two projects that are even in the phase where they're starting to actually try and build what's called a tokamak. I just like the word tokamak.
It's a pretty good word.
It's a really cool word, but then the problem is that there's only been limited studies that have shown that the amount of energy to get that fusion to happen, as you said, to push the particles together, it doesn't outweigh, like, it's very hard to get that difference where you're getting more out than what you put in.
Mm. So it's essentially what we're looking for is net gain fusion.
Yeah, so the trade-off is that do we like hold out and risk like a future where we don't have enough energy to provide that growth that we need, and wait for fusion, or do we use what we have and what may be a little bit more like it may be a bit more reactive, but it's kind of something that we know how to build.
Yeah, I think that nuclear energy is actually incredible, right? It's fairly expensive. It's definitely more expensive than solar power, but you can also produce a lot more of it with, like from a certain amount of land.
It's only expensive to get to point A when to get to that point where you've switched on the power, as it were. That's when the expense kind of, because I know South Africa does have export uranium, or we have a few uranium reserves. You can take a remarkably small amount of uranium and power like a whole city for many months or many weeks.
Yeah, and across the board, it's like nuclear energy. It essentially emits zero carbon dioxide, right? But despite us having three or four nuclear catastrophes in the past 70 years, is including all the deaths from Fukushima, from Chernobyl, including the later deaths from the passive radiation in the background, it is still one of the safest forms of energy production per terawatt hour. So adjusted for terawatt hours, with brown coal, we have 32.72 deaths per terawatt hour. And that's entirely due to just like respiratory disease or the mining process killing people, accidents, etc., etc. Then you've got coal, which is 25 deaths per terawatt hour. Oil is sitting at 18 and a half. And then we get down to nuclear, which has got 0.07 deaths per terawatt hour, which is just above wind with 0.04 deaths per terawatt hour. And I assume that wind power only ever kills people by accident as well, like a giant fin falls on someone during production. But so it's actually an incredibly safe form of energy, unless, and I think that this is the big reason to regulate nuclear energy, but I will get into some other options afterwards, is the problem with nuclear energy as it stands right now is that if you can build a power station, you can theoretically build nuclear weapons. And nuclear weapons are absolutely terrifying. I think that we've become a bit desensitized to the concept of nuclear weapons from the media, because they're talked about so much, and it's like, oh, the president with his briefcase and the red buttons, and it's like, ooh, yeah, you can destroy stuff, but it's like, no, nuclear weapons are literally the only thing that we have created that can effectively wipe us out. It's hard to imagine, but just kind of picture it. You're sitting at your house in Cape Town, and there's just like a blinding flash outside your window, and you look up, and there's just this expanding ball, and it'll literally destroy and obviously kill everyone, but destroy this entire space with everyone inside of it for kilometers in every direction. And then everyone outside of the blast radius is probably going to die from heat as well. And if they don't die from heat, they're going to die from radiation poisoning. If they don't die from radiation poisoning, they're going to die from radiation exposure over the next month or so. It is absolutely terrifying. And I'm sure you can tell from that description that I am very, very much against nuclear proliferation, because all it takes is just one rogue government, right? It's why people talk about North Korea, because North Korea isn't that unique in it being a dictatorship, right? We have countries that are like have human rights travesties happening. We talk about North Korea because they potentially have nuclear weapons, and that makes it a problem for everyone else in the world.
Is that risk worth the environmental impact?
It's a very good question, but I think that we can get around that. So as you mentioned, there are a bunch of new technologies that can be used for building nuclear power plants currently. And have you heard of the thorium reactor?
Yeah, I was gonna bring it up.
Yeah, you take it away. Tell me about the thorium reactor.
So there was like a critical juncture in the sort of development phase of the I think it was the Manhattan Project, where they were developing the atomic bomb. There was a lot of nuclear physics going on at the time, and basically there were these two forms of nuclear power, or ways to harness nuclear energy to build to have energy output that was more than the input. Um, the one was the fission that we see today, and the other one was a thorium based reactor. Now, the good thing about the thorium based reactor is that when it got to a critical sort of state, you could switch it off, and it would go back to a sort of static, or back to a low energy state that wasn't an explosion. So you could turn it on, and then you could like switch it off. With the fission way, the uranium based reactors, you had to do that sort of maintenance of the reaction. So if something went wrong, it basically exploded, and the energy was exothermic. And the reason why we have today fission and not thorium reactors, or uranium based and not thorium based, is because at the time there was a war going on, and that obviously the United States were like, we've got to get ahead of this, and so they developed the uranium side. So there's an argument out there that if at that point they'd chosen thorium, we would have a lot more very safe forms of energy out there.
Mm-hmm. Is I think that thorium is absolutely incredible. So I'm by no means a nuclear physicist, so I'm going to try my best to not butcher what I'm about to say. But inside of our traditional uranium reactors, when we start the process, it has to be inside of water, right? Because that water actually slows down these particles to make sure that we don't have a runaway reaction. And every plant that has melted down in history, every big nuclear travesty that has happened has been because the water pumps stopped working, right? Is the water pumps are super important because we need them to make sure that reaction stays under control. Now, what happens with thorium is that firstly the particles actually move slower, but for every extra particle that is hit, it only gives off roughly one other particle. So the reaction never grows. It always stays the same or decreases. So that's why they talk about thorium as being walk-away safe. Is that if you have it running and you leave
Mm.
and something goes wrong, it will probably just stop working.
Yeah, it's like this the idea of like fail safe. So if something goes wrong, it gets to a safe position, whereas in uranium, it's fail fail unsafe, where it's like
Yeah, the uranium's fail unsafe, right? But another potential way to make these plants even safer are by using melting valves. So essentially, what you have is you've got the chamber where the reaction is happening, and it's probably heating up some or other type of fluid to turn a turbine. And then there's a big old valve that leads into a whole bunch of drainage tanks. And this valve is a special kind of valve that is made out of a material that it melts at a specific temperature. So if the reaction gets out of control and everything gets too hot, that valve melts away and everything just drains into these drainage tanks and everything becomes inert. Then the third thing that's actually also really interesting, and this can be implemented in a lot of other plants, and isn't necessarily thorium based, is that uh, using molten salts as a energy storage mechanism. So instead of trying to ramp up and down power based on demand, what it is that it runs at a baseline and it just heats up these molten salts that act as a battery, and then the energy is just extracted from the molten salt and turned into electrical energy, or heat
mm.
energy is transferred to warm homes and stuff.
The one thing that's like kind of constant, no matter which direction we go, whether it's thermal or nuclear or power. The one thing that we need now is that development of knowledge. Like I know there's like superconductors that they're getting to a stage where they can almost have superconductivity at almost room temperatures, or
Mm-hmm.
not sub-zero temperatures. It's the problem is like do we necessarily have that knowledge around or available, or is it going to come to a point where we have like one or two countries that are basically withholding that knowledge, and that knowledge also transpires into the way that people think, and we can maybe think about people who are against nuclear or against some of these other options, the thought pattern, like they're probably thinking of they're thinking of a few examples where something went bad. So maybe there's a failing in the way that people think about it statistically, or there's not a good conversation about those trade-offs.
And I think what I failed to mention about thorium reactors is it's very difficult to use them to create fissile material for nuclear weapons, which is really important. So to answer your question, I think that we should be using nuclear power, absolutely, because we are at a fork in the roads. Well, we kind of passed that fork a while back, but we should be doing everything we can to prevent
Yeah.
rampant climate change from continuing.
But then also, so it's also a scale, right? So the problem with nuclear, and we could kind of get towards the conclusions now. So nuclear, I agree, we both agree that nuclear is good. But the thing is, a nuclear power plant tends to take a long time to build. So in that time, we shouldn't have it as a saving grace, and we should move towards this, diverse mix of energies. So you will have nuclear being like the base layer. When fission is available, fusion, then switch out nuclear for fusion. But at the same time, you're still developing like complex grid technologies, battery technologies. They all kind of need to be happening at the same time, as long as we're moving away from the coal, the fossil fuels, and all of those kind of things.
I think that thorium reactions will be a great way to power the world. And in the meantime, we do need to focus on renewables like solar, like wind, like hydro. Hydro is actually an interesting one because hydro also like damages ecosystems.
Yeah,
But I I don't think that renewables are going to solve our problems. Like the world requires more energy than we can provide with solar and wind power. There's a video by Kurzgesagt, the In a Nutshell guys, that came out recently called "Can You Stop Climate Change?" And the thumbnail is just like a big no. Um, and it's actually a really interesting watch, very well animated. That talks about rampant climate change and what a person's personal impacts are and how you can actually make a difference. And their conclusion is super interesting, and I highly recommend people go and check that out. Uh, but I'd say that, well, what you said earlier in this episode is definitely true. Is we need to stop calling it, the climate change and start calling it the climate crisis because it is actually what it is.